September 1883, Redemption, Creek, Wyoming Territory. The autumn sun beat down on the town square with the kind of heat that makes men squint, and women shield their faces with parasols. But on this particular Thursday afternoon, the weather was the least of anyone's concerns. A crowd of nearly 60 souls had gathered around a makeshift wooden platform, their attention fixed on 7 children standing in a line like cattle at market. Nathaniel Brennan stood at the back of that crowd hat, pulled low over his eyes, watching something that turned his stomach. He had come to town for supplies. Nothing more. A sack of flour, some coffee, maybe nails for the fence that needed mending. He had not come for this. But here he was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from what was unfolding before him. The man on the platform was Cornelius Blackwood, owner of the Blackwood Home for Orphaned Children. He wore a suit too fine for Wyoming dust, a gold watch chain glinting across his vest. His smile was wide and practiced the smile of a man who had sold many things to many people. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying across the square with rehearsed projection, "we have here 7 fine children, healthy and able-bodied, ready to contribute to your farms and homes. Strong backs, willing hands, an investment in your future prosperity." Investment. The word made Nate's jaw tighten. These were children, not livestock. The eldest boy stood at the front of the line. Samuel, they called him, 14 years old, broad-shouldered for his age, with dark hair and eyes that held far too much wariness for someone so young. His arms were wrapped protectively around the smaller children clustered behind him. A girl of 12 with honey-colored hair and a face pale with fear. A boy of 10 who looked ready to bolt or fight, his small fists clenched at his sides. A girl of 8 who had not spoken a word since they arrived, according to the whispers Nate overheard. A boy of 6, thin as a rail and coughing into his sleeve. A girl of 4 with curls and tear-stained cheeks. And a baby barely old enough to walk balanced on the hip of the 12-year-old girl. 7 souls. 7 lives hanging in the balance. "Now," Blackwood continued, gesturing toward Samuel, "this fine young man here can work a full day's labor, strong as an ox. I'll start the bidding at $20. A farmer near the front raised his hand. "20! 30! called another. Samuel's face went rigid. His eyes darted to his siblings, then back to the crowd, and Nate saw something in that look. Pure terror masked by forced courage. The boy was trying to be strong for the others, but he was breaking inside. "We stay together," Samuel said, his voice cracking but firm. "We're family. We don't get split up." Blackwood's smile never wavered, but something cold flashed in his eyes. "Son, these good people are offering you a home. You should be grateful." "We have each other," the boy insisted, his voice rising. "That's all the home we need." The crack of Blackwood's hand across Samuel's face echoed through the square like a gunshot. The boy's head snapped to the side and the crowd fell silent. For a moment no one moved, no one breathed. Then the younger boy, the 10-year-old, lunged forward with a shout of rage. Samuel caught him, held him back, though the effort cost him. Nate could see the boy's legs shaking, see the way he was fighting to stay upright after that blow. In that instant something shifted in Nathaniel Brennan. The past 4 years had been a fog of grief and hollow routine. Wake up, work the land, eat because the body required it, sleep because exhaustion demanded it. No joy, no purpose. Just the mechanical continuation of a life that had stopped meaning anything the day Sarah died. Sarah. Her name still hurt to think. She had been everything bright and good in his world. When she died giving birth to their son, when that tiny boy lived only 3 days before following his mother into the ground, Nate had buried more than his family. He had buried himself. But standing there in that town square, watching 7 terrified children face an uncertain fate, he heard Sarah's voice. Not a memory. Something deeper. Something that felt like her hand on his shoulder, her breath on his ear. "Promise me," she had whispered, In those final moments, her hand weak in his. "Promise you'll find someone to care for. Don't die alone like this, Nate. Please." He had made that promise. Then he had spent 4 years breaking it, retreating into solitude on his ranch with only his mother-in-law Maggie for company. He had convinced himself that being alone was easier, safer, no one else to lose. Now, looking at those 7 faces, he understood what Sarah had been trying to tell him. It was not about avoiding pain, it was about finding purpose in spite of it. Nate stepped forward and the crowd parted as he moved through them, boots heavy on the packed dirt. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with the sun-weathered face of someone who lived by the land. His dark hair needed cutting, his jaw needed shaving, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made people step aside. How much, his voice cut through the murmuring crowd. For all 7. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Blackwood seemed taken aback, though he recovered quickly, his merchant's instincts sharpening. All 7, Blackwood's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Well, now that's quite an undertaking, Mr. Brennan. Nathaniel Brennan." I asked how much. Blackwood stroked his chin, calculating. "For all 7 children properly documented, I would need $500. A woman in the crowd gasped. A man laughed outright. $500 was more than most people saw in 2 years. It was a fortune. It was robbery. Nate knew he did not have $500. He had $400 in his savings money he had been setting aside for a new barn, for stock to expand the herd, for repairs and emergencies, and the future he was not sure he believed in anymore. $400, Nate said, his voice level and hard. "That's what I have. Take it or leave it." Blackwood's smile faltered for just a moment, and in that moment Nate saw the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. $400 was still a substantial sum, more than Blackwood would likely get by selling the children individually, especially if the townspeople started questioning the legality of what was happening here. $400 it is, Mr. Brennan," Blackwood said, extending his hand. "You've got yourself a deal." Nate did not take the hand. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat pocket and counted out the bills, each one representing hours of labor, sweat, and sacrifice. He handed them to Blackwood without ceremony, then turned to face the 7 children still standing on that platform. 7 pairs of eyes stared back at him, suspicious, afraid, desperate, hopeful, a tangle of emotions that made his chest tight. "Come on," Nate said simply. "We're going home." None of them moved. Samuel's arm tightened around his siblings, and Nate saw the boy's mind working, trying to determine if this new situation was better or worse than what they had just escaped. "I said, come on." Nate's voice was gentler this time. "My wagon's over at the general store. We've got a ride ahead of us." Samuel was the first to step down from the platform, his movements careful and controlled. The others followed, staying close to him. They moved as a unit, a small tribe of survivors who had learned to trust only each other. As they passed Blackwood, Nate heard the man mutter something under his breath to a woman standing nearby, a severe-looking woman with iron-gray hair and a pinched expression. Mrs. Helena Whitmore, if Nate remembered correctly. She worked for the Children's Aid Society. 30 days, Blackwood murmured. "The law requires proof of adequate care. We'll see how long this lasts." Nate heard it, understood it. Blackwood had no intention of letting this sale stand. This was just a delay, a temporary setback. The man would be coming for these children, and he would use every legal trick he could find to get them back. Fine, let him come. Nate had not felt anything close to fight in 4 years, but he felt it now. These 7 had just become his to protect, and he would be damned if he let anyone take them. The wagon was exactly where Nate had left it, hitched to his 2 sturdy horses. He had already loaded his supplies, though the sacks of flour and coffee seemed somehow inadequate now. He was bringing home 7 more mouths to feed, 7 lives that depended on him. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like waking up after a long, dreamless sleep. "Climb in the back," Nate instructed. "It's about 5 miles to the ranch, not too far." The children climbed into the wagon bed with the same cautious movements they had used leaving the platform, all except the baby, who the 12-year-old girl still held. The little one had fallen asleep against her sister's shoulder thumb, in her mouth, oblivious to the upheaval in her young life. Nate climbed up onto the driver's seat and took the reins. As he guided the horses away from the town square, he could feel 7 pairs of eyes boring into his back. They were watching him, judging him, trying to decide what kind of man he was. He did not blame them. They had learned the hard way that adults could not be trusted, that promises meant nothing, that home was a word without meaning. He would have to show them different. Words would not be enough. Only time and action would convince them that this was real, that they were safe now. The ride out of town was silent except for the creak of the wagon and the steady clip of hooves on packed earth. Nate kept his eyes forward, giving the children space to process what had just happened. He could hear their whispers in the wagon bed behind him, low and urgent. "What's he going to do with us?" That was the 10-year-old, the one who had tried to fight. "I don't know," Samuel's voice steady despite the fear underneath. "But we stay together, no matter what. If he tries to split us up, we run." "Where would we go?" The 12-year-old girl, her words barely audible. "Anywhere. We've survived worse." Had they? Nate wondered what these children had endured before ending up at Blackwood's home. Orphaned, obviously. But the details of how and why would come later if they chose to share them. For now, all that mattered was getting them home, getting them fed, getting them to understand that they were not prisoners or property. They were family now. His family. The thought was strange and new and terrifying and right all at once. The landscape opened up as they left Redemption Creek behind. Rolling grassland stretched in every direction, dotted with scrub brush, and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. The mountains rose in the distance, blue and hazy, against the horizon. It was harsh country in many ways, unforgiving to those who did not respect it. But there was a beauty to it too, a stark honesty that Nate had always appreciated. "It's big," the whisper came from one of the younger children. Nate was not sure which one. "Empty," another voice added. Not empty, Nate thought, just spacious, room to breathe, room to heal. The ranch appeared gradually as they crested a low rise. The main house stood solid and square, built from logs and weathered by Wyoming wind, not large but well maintained. The barn was in good repair, the fences straight. A windmill turned lazily in the breeze, drawing water from the well. Cattle grazed in the far pasture, dark shapes against golden grass. It was not much, but it was honest. It was home. As Nate pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, the door opened and Maggie stepped out onto the porch. Margaret Brennan, 65 years old, gray-haired and sharp-eyed. Sarah's mother and the only family Nate had left in the world. She took one look at the wagon full of children, and her eyebrows rose, but she did not look surprised. Maggie had always had an uncanny ability to sense when something important was about to happen. "Nathaniel," she said calmly, as if he brought home 7 orphans every Thursday. "I see you found more than flour in town." "Yes, ma'am." Nate climbed down from the wagon and turned to help the children. "They'll be staying with us." Maggie's eyes swept over the 7 faces peering from the wagon bed, and something in her expression softened. "Well then, best get them inside and fed. They look half-starved." She disappeared into the house without another word, and Nate heard her moving about in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of a meal being prepared. Maggie was practical to her core. Questions could wait. Hunger could not. "Come on," Nate said, offering his hand to help the first child down. Samuel ignored the hand and jumped down on his own, then turned to help his siblings. One by one they climbed out of the wagon, staying close together, their eyes darting around as if memorizing escape routes. The 12-year-old was the last still holding the baby. Nate stepped forward and carefully took the sleeping child from her arms. The girl tensed, ready to snatch the baby back, But Nate just adjusted the small weight against his shoulder and gestured toward the house. "Go on in. My mother won't bite, I promise." The girl hesitated, then followed her siblings up the porch steps and through the front door. Nate stood there for a moment, the baby warm and trusting against him, and felt something crack open in his chest. This tiny child had no idea who he was, no reason to trust him, yet she slept peacefully in his arms. It was a gift he did not deserve, that kind of innocent faith. Inside, the children had clustered near the door, unwilling to venture further into the house. Maggie was ladling soup into bowls at the long kitchen table, her movements efficient and sure. "Sit," she said, not unkindly. "All of you, wash your hands in that basin there, then sit and eat." They obeyed, moving like a small, cautious herd to the wash basin. Samuel helped the younger ones, his movements practiced, and Nate realized the boy had been doing this for a long time. Playing parent, keeping his siblings alive. When they were seated around the table, Maggie placed bowls of hot soup in front of each child, along with thick slices of bread and butter. The children stared at the food as if it might vanish if they blinked. "Eat," Maggie repeated gently. "There's plenty more where that came from." Still they did not move. They looked to Samuel, waiting for permission or approval. The boy studied his bowl, then glanced at Nate, who had taken a seat at the head of the table with the baby still in his arms. Nate picked up his spoon with his free hand and took a bite of soup. Only then did Samuel nod to his siblings, and 7 children began to eat. They were ravenous. That much was clear. But they tried to hide it, tried to eat slowly and politely, as if good manners might protect them from some unknown punishment. It broke Nate's heart a little, watching them work so hard to be what they thought he wanted. "You can have seconds," he said quietly, "and thirds. Eat until you're full." The 10-year-old looked up, soup dripping from his chin. "Really, really." Permission granted, the children ate with more enthusiasm, though they still watched Nate from the corners of their eyes, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. When the meal was finished and the bowls were empty, Maggie stood and began gathering dishes. The 12-year-old girl jumped up to help, but Maggie waved her back down. "You've done enough today, child. Rest." The girl sat looking lost, without a task to perform. Nate stood, the baby still asleep, against his shoulder and addressed the 7 tired faces around his table. "We need to talk about sleeping arrangements. The girls will take the upstairs room. The boys can have the storage room in the back. I've already set it up with beds." "Where will you sleep?" Samuel's question was wary, loaded with implications. Nate met the boy's eyes steadily. "The barn. So you know I'm not coming into your rooms at night. So you know you're safe." Silence. The children exchanged glances, unsure how to process this. "Why?" The question came from the 12-year-old girl, barely above a whisper. "Because you've been through enough," Nate said simply, "and trust has to be earned. I aim to earn it." He handed the baby to Samuel, who took her with automatic care, and then Nate led the way through the house. The upstairs room was small but clean, with 2 beds and a window that looked out over the ranch. The storage room had been converted into a bunk room, with 4 narrow beds lined against the walls. "Get some rest," Nate said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out the details. For tonight, just sleep." He left them there, these 7 strangers who were now his responsibility, and walked out to the barn. The night air was cool against his face, and above him the stars were beginning to appear sharp and bright in the darkening sky. Inside the barn, Nate made himself a pallet in the corner near the horses. It was not comfortable, but it was adequate. He had slept in worse places during his time in the cavalry, before he met Sarah, before he believed in the possibility of home. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night, the horses shifting in their stalls, the wind through the eaves, and from the house very faintly the sound of children's voices. He could not make out the words, but he did not need to. He knew what they were doing, planning, strategizing, preparing for whatever came next. It would take time to convince them they were home. time and patience and consistency. But Nate had time. For the first time in 4 years, he had something worth spending it on. From the house, Maggie appeared, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She crossed the yard to the barn and stood in the doorway, backlit by the lamplight from the house. "You did a good thing today, Nathaniel. Maybe, or maybe I just took on more than I can handle." Sarah would be proud. The words hit him harder than expected. He sat up, swallowing against the sudden tightness in his throat. "I hope so. I'm doing this for her as much as for them. I know." Maggie's voice was soft with understanding. "But make sure you're also doing it for yourself. You've been dead these past 4 years, son. Maybe these children will remind you how to live." She turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and Nathaniel, I think you should know. I saw Blackwood talking to Mrs. Whitmore after you left town. They're planning something." Nate stood, his jaw tightening. "Let them plan. Those children are mine now, legally bought and paid for. The law can be complicated when it comes to orphans. Just be prepared." After Maggie left, Nate lay back down, but sleep was a long time coming. His mind kept circling back to those 7 faces, 7 promises he had made without speaking a word, to keep them safe, to keep them fed, to keep them together, to never raise a hand against them, to never abandon them. 7 children, 7 promises, and 30 days to prove he could keep them. In the darkness of the barn, Nate whispered a prayer to Sarah, to God, to anyone who might be listening. "Help me do this right. Help me be what they need." The only answer was the wind and the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and determined in his chest. Tomorrow would bring challenges he could not yet imagine, but tonight 7 children were sleeping under his roof, safe and fed and together. For now, that was enough. It had to be. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Wyoming plains, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and gold. Nathaniel Brennan had been awake for an hour already, feeding the horses and checking the cattle in the near pasture. Old habits from his cavalry days: rise before the sun, work before breakfast, keep moving or the ghosts catch up. But this morning felt different. The barn that had served as his bedroom carried the scent of hay and leather, familiar and grounding. Yet when he looked toward the house, he saw lamplight glowing in the windows. 7 children were waking up under his roof, 7 lives that depended on him not to fail. The weight of it should have crushed him. Instead, it felt like purpose. He crossed the yard as the sun crested the horizon, boots crunching on frost-touched grass. Inside, he found Maggie already in the kitchen, working at the stove. The smell of frying bacon and fresh biscuits filled the room. At the long table, 7 children sat in silence, their faces wary in the morning light. They had dressed in the same clothes from yesterday. Samuel sat at one end, the baby on his lap. The 12-year-old girl, whose name Nate still did not know, sat beside him, her posture rigid with tension. The others were arranged in descending order of age, a hierarchy born of survival. "Morning," Nate said, hanging his hat by the door. 7 pairs of eyes tracked his movement. No one spoke. Maggie set plates of food on the table, more than Nate had seen her cook in years. Eggs and bacon biscuits with butter and jam, fried potatoes. A feast for people who expected crumbs. "Eat up," Maggie said. "Growing children need proper meals." They ate, but the wariness remained. Trust was not built in a single night, no matter how warm the beds or how full the bellies. When breakfast was finished, Nate stood and addressed Samuel directly. "I need to show you boys how things work around here. The morning chores. You'll be helping with them." Samuel's eyes narrowed. What kind of work? Feeding animals, collecting eggs. Simple tasks. Nothing you can't handle. "How long do we work?" The 10-year-old spoke up, his voice sharp with suspicion. "At Blackwoods, we worked from sunup to sundown, sometimes longer." Nate met the boy's eyes. "Here you work mornings, 3, maybe 4 hours. Afternoons are yours, for school or play or whatever you want." The children exchanged glances, clearly not believing him. "Come on," Nate said. I'll show you." Samuel stood slowly, then gestured for his brothers to follow. The youngest boy, the 6-year-old with the persistent cough, hung back until Samuel nodded encouragement. Together, the 4 males of the group followed Nate outside. The morning air was crisp, the kind of cold that woke a person fully and completely. Nate led them to the chicken coop first, a sturdy structure he had built 3 years ago when Maggie insisted they needed fresh eggs. "Chickens need feeding twice a day," Nate explained, scooping grain from a barrel, morning and evening. "You scatter the feed like this." He demonstrated, tossing the grain in a wide arc. The chickens clucked and converged, pecking eagerly. He handed the scoop to Samuel. "Your turn." The boy took it, his movements careful and precise. He fed the chickens exactly as Nate had shown him, then passed the scoop to the 10-year-old. "What's your name?" Nate asked the younger boy. The child hesitated, as if names were dangerous things to share. "Tommy." "Tommy, good. And you?" Nate turned to the 6-year-old who was watching the chickens with wide eyes. "Jacob." The voice was barely a whisper. "Jacob, all right." Nate gestured to the coop. "Collecting eggs comes next. Reach under the hens gently. They'll peck if you're rough, but they won't really hurt you." Tommy approached a nesting box with more confidence than Nate expected. He slipped his hand beneath a fat brown hen and withdrew an egg triumphant. Jacob tried to copy him, but pulled his hand back when the hen shifted. "She won't hurt you," Nate said quietly. "Just talk to her. Let her know you're not a threat." Jacob tried again, whispering something Nate could not hear. This time he retrieved the egg successfully, his face lighting with surprised pride. They worked their way through the coop, collecting 24 eggs in a wooden basket. Then Nate led them to the barn, where the horses needed feeding and watering. He showed them how to measure the grain, how to check the water troughs, how to approach the animals with calm confidence. Samuel watched everything with the intensity of someone memorizing an escape route. Tommy asked questions, his natural curiosity breaking through the caution. Jacob coughed into his sleeve and worked quietly, his small hands careful with every task. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed higher, warming the air. When they finished with the horses, Nate led them back toward the house. "That's it," Tommy asked, disbelief clear in his voice. "We're done. For this morning, yes. After lunch there might be fence mending or other repairs, but that's work I'll do with you, not make you do alone." Why, Samuel's question was blunt. "At Blackwood's, he said we had to earn our keep, work for our food and beds." Nate stopped walking and turned to face the 3 boys. He chose his words carefully, knowing they would measure every syllable against their past experiences. "You're not earning anything here. This is your home. Family helps each other, but no one earns the right to eat or sleep safely. Those things are yours because you're here, because you're mine now." The word hung in the air, mine, not in the sense of property, though Nate knew that was how they might hear it. Mine in the way that mattered. Mine to protect, mine to care for, mine to raise. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The boy was not ready to believe. That was fine. Belief would come with time. They returned to the house to find Maggie teaching the girls. The 12-year-old and the 8-year-old were learning to knead bread dough, while the 4-year-old played with the baby on a blanket by the fire. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that it made Nate's chest ache with memories of what he had lost. Sarah would have loved this, a house full of children, laughter and chaos and purpose. "The girls will help me with cooking and household tasks," Maggie said when she noticed Nate watching. "Not because they have to, but because they want to learn. Isn't that right, dear?" The 12-year-old nodded, though her expression remained guarded. She had not spoken since yesterday, not a single word. Nate wondered what horrors had taught her that silence was safer than speech. Lunch was simple. Sandwiches and milk with fresh bread the girls had helped bake. Again the children ate in silence, but the tension had eased slightly. They were beginning to understand that food would not be withheld, that meals would come regularly. After lunch, Nate took Tommy and Samuel to the far pasture to check fence posts. Jacob stayed behind, his cough worsening in the afternoon heat. Maggie insisted he rest, and for once the boy did not argue. The work was straightforward. Walk the fence line, test each post for stability, replace or reinforce where needed. Nate worked alongside the boys, showing them how to dig post holes, how to set the wood firmly in the ground. "At Blackwoods," Tommy said suddenly, driving a post into the earth with surprising strength, "he used to say we were worthless, broken, that no one would ever want us." Nate stopped working. He was wrong. Was he? Tommy's voice cracked. "Our parents died. No one else wanted us. We ended up in that place because we weren't good enough for anyone else." The pain in the boy's words cut deep. Nate set down his tools and sat on the ground, gesturing for Tommy and Samuel to join him. They hesitated, then sat maintaining careful distance. "Listen to me," Nate said, his voice low and steady. "What happened to your parents wasn't your fault. Death comes for everyone, and it doesn't care about fair or right. You ended up at Blackwoods because the system failed you, not because you weren't good enough." "Then why did you want us?" Samuel asked, the question loaded with challenge. "7 kids you don't know, 7 mouths to feed. What do you get out of this?" Nate could have lied, could have given them some easy answer about Christian duty or loneliness, but these children had earned honesty even if it hurt. "4 years ago, my wife Sarah died giving birth to our son. The baby lived 3 days. I held him when he died." The words came hard, each one dragged up from a place Nate usually kept locked tight. "After that, I stopped living. I worked the ranch because the land demanded it, but I wasn't really here. I was just going through the motions, waiting to die." He looked at both boys, at their young faces, marked by old pain. "Then I saw you on that platform yesterday, 7 children about to be split apart, and I heard Sarah's voice in my head, telling me what she told me before she died. Find someone to care for. Don't die alone. So we're your second chance." Samuel's tone was bitter. "A replacement for what you lost?" "No." Nate's answer was firm. "You're not a replacement for anything. You're 7 people who needed help, and I was in a position to give it. But somewhere in that, I found something I'd lost. A reason to wake up in the morning. A reason to try." Tommy looked down at his hands, dirt-stained and calloused from too much work at too young an age. "Mr. Brennan, why do you sleep in the barn?" "To prove something to you. That you're safe here. That I'm not like the men who hurt you before." "Blackwood used to—" Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. "He used to come into the girls' room at night. Eliza, she's the oldest girl. He would—" The boy could not finish, but he did not need to. Nate understood. The rage that rose in him was cold, and controlled the kind of anger that did not explode but calcified into resolve. "He'll never touch any of you again," Nate said quietly. "I promise you that." They sat in silence for a long moment, the 3 of them side by side in the grass, the fence half mended and forgotten. Then Samuel spoke, his voice barely audible. "My name is Samuel Porter. Tommy and I are brothers. So are Jacob, Ruth Grace, and Hope. Eliza is our sister too, but from our mother's first marriage. Our parents died 2 years ago. Fever took them both within a week. We had no other family. The county sent us to Blackwoods." "How long were you there?" 23 months, 1 week, 4 days. Samuel's precision spoke volumes about how carefully he had counted every moment of captivity. "It's over now," Nate said. "Is it?" Samuel met his eyes. "You heard Blackwood yesterday. He's coming back. He'll use the law to take us. He always does." Nate had heard, had spent half the night thinking about it. "Then we'll fight him with the law too. I paid for you fair and square. You're mine by legal purchase." The words sounded wrong even as he said them. Children should not be bought. But the law was the law, and Nate would use every weapon at his disposal to protect what was now his. "Come on," he said, standing and offering his hand to pull the boys up. "Let's finish this fence, then I'll teach you to shoot." Both boys' eyes widened. Shoot. Every person on a ranch should know how to handle a gun, for protection and for hunting. If you're going to be part of this family, You'll learn." He had their attention now. The wariness remained, but beneath it, Nate saw the first flicker of something else. Interest, maybe even trust. They finished the fence work as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Back at the house, Nate retrieved his rifle and a bag of empty cans. He set up targets in the field behind the barn, then showed the boys how to hold the weapon, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. Samuel went first. His shot went wide, but not by much. Tommy's was closer. Even Jacob, his small frame braced against the rifle's kick, managed to hit a can on his third try. "Good," Nate said, his voice carrying genuine pride. "You're all natural shots. With practice, you'll be even better." "Why are you teaching us this?" Samuel asked, lowering the rifle. "Because you should know how to protect yourselves. Because skills matter. And because I trust you with this responsibility." Trust. The word seemed to surprise Samuel more than anything else Nate had said. They returned to the house as twilight painted the sky purple and gold. Inside, the girls had helped Maggie prepare dinner. The smell of roasted chicken and vegetables filled the kitchen, warm and welcoming. They gathered around the table again, this pattern already becoming familiar. But tonight, as Maggie set the baby in a high chair and everyone took their seats, something felt different. The silence was less oppressive, the fear less sharp. Nate had just picked up his fork when Jacob began to cough, not the light clearing of a throat, but deep racking spasms that shook his small body. The boy doubled over his face, reddening, then paling. He could not catch his breath. Nate was out of his chair in an instant, pulling Jacob up and supporting the boy's weight. "Get me water," he said to Maggie, his voice calm despite the spike of fear. But the water did not help. Jacob's breathing grew more labored, his lips taking on a blue tinge. The other children watched with wide, terrified eyes, and Nate saw in their faces the memory of other times when sickness had taken people they loved. "Upstairs," Nate commanded, carrying Jacob toward the stairs. "Samuel, bring the water. Maggie, I need wet cloths and that bottle of medicine Doc Morrison gave us last year." He carried Jacob to the boy's room and laid him on the bed, tilting the boy's head back to open his airway. The coughing fit was subsiding, but Jacob's breathing remained shallow and strained. Maggie appeared with the cloths and medicine. Nate had learned basic field medicine during his cavalry years enough to know that Jacob's lungs were compromised probably from months or years of poor care and inadequate nutrition. He made Jacob drink the medicine, bitter but effective. Then he placed the wet cloths on the boy's forehead and chest, cooling the fever that was beginning to spike. "Will he die?" Grace's small voice came from the doorway where all 6 of her siblings had gathered. "No," Nate said firmly. "He's going to be fine. I'm going to make sure of it." It was a promise he had no right to make. Sickness could take anyone regardless of care or intention. But these children needed certainty, needed to believe that someone could keep them safe. Nate sat beside Jacob's bed as night fell. The other children eventually went to their rooms, though Nate suspected none of them slept. Maggie brought him coffee and a blanket, then retreated to her own room with the baby. Alone with the sick child, Nate kept vigil. He monitored Jacob's breathing, changed the cloths when they grew warm, held the boy's hand when fever dreams made him whimper. Around midnight, the door creaked open. Samuel stepped in, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "You should sleep," the boy said. "So should you." Samuel moved closer, looking down at his younger brother. "He's been sick for a long time, since before our parents died. They couldn't afford medicine. At Blackwoods, he just got worse. He'll get better here." Nate adjusted the cloth on Jacob's forehead. "I'll make sure he gets what he needs." Why? The question again. Samuel seemed determined to understand Nate's motivations to find the crack in the facade. "Because I failed my own son," Nate said quietly. "He was sick from birth. Nothing I did helped. I watched him die, and I couldn't stop it." He looked up at Samuel. "I can't save everyone, but I can save Jacob, and I will." Samuel stood there for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He sat down on the other side of Jacob's bed, mirroring Nate's position. "I'll help," the boy said simply. They sat together through the night, taking turns monitoring Jacob's breathing and changing the cloths. They did not speak much, but something passed between them in those quiet hours. An understanding. The beginning of something that might eventually become trust. By dawn, Jacob's fever had broken. His breathing was still rough but stronger, more regular. When his eyes finally opened as the sun rose, he looked confused to find both Nate and Samuel beside him. "You stayed." Jacob's voice was raspy but wondering. "All night," Samuel confirmed. Jacob looked at Nate. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." Nate stood his back, protesting the hours in the chair. "You're my son now. That means when you're sick, I stay." The word hung in the air. Son. Nate had not planned to say it, but it felt right. These 7 were his now, whether the law agreed or not. Jacob's eyes filled with tears, but he smiled. It was the first real smile Nate had seen from any of the children. Downstairs, Maggie was already cooking breakfast. The girls were helping moving with more confidence than yesterday. When Nate appeared with Samuel and a weak but walking Jacob, the relief on their faces was palpable. They gathered around the table again, this family that was learning to be a family. The food was eaten with less wariness, the silence less heavy. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. After breakfast, there was a knock at the door. Nate opened it to find Sheriff Tom Briggs standing on the porch, hat in hand. They had known each other for years, had served together briefly in the cavalry. "Tom." "Nate. Heard you took in some children." 7 of them. What of it?" Briggs shifted uncomfortably. "Cornelius Blackwood filed a complaint. Says you have to prove you can care for them properly. The court's giving you 30 days. Then there's a hearing." Behind Nate, he felt the children tense. Heard Grace's small gasp of fear. "Let them come," Nate said. "I'll prove whatever I need to prove." Briggs handed him an official-looking document. "You'll need to show income, proper housing supervision for the girls. The law requires a woman in the house for that. I have Maggie." "Might not be enough." Briggs lowered his voice. "Blackwood's got Mrs. Whitmore on his side. She's got influence with the Children's Aid Society. They're going to fight you on this." After Briggs left, Nate turned to find 7 pairs of eyes watching him, waiting, fearing. He knelt down, bringing himself to their level. "Listen to me, all of you. I made a promise yesterday when I brought you home. I'm going to say it out loud now, so you all hear it." He looked at each child in turn. "I promise you 7 things. A roof over your heads, food in your bellies, skills to survive, protection from anyone who tries to hurt you. I will never raise my hand against you. I will never sell you. And I will never ever abandon you. Not for 30 days, not for 30 years. You're mine now, and I don't give up what's mine." The silence that followed was different from before, charged with something Nate could not quite name. Then Grace, the 4-year-old with curls and tear-stained cheeks, walked across the room and wrapped her small arms around Nate's leg. "Papa," she said simply. The word hit Nate like a physical blow. Papa. No one had called him that. His son had died before ever learning to speak. He picked Grace up, holding her close, and felt the fractures in his heart begin to mend. "Yes," he whispered. "Papa's here." One by one the other children moved closer. Not all of them ready to use that word, but all of them ready to try believing that maybe, just maybe, this man meant what he said. 30 days. It was not much time, but Nate Brennan had spent 4 years dying. Now he had a reason to fight. And fight he would. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Nate with its rightness. Mornings began before dawn, with chores, the boys learning to work the land, while the girls helped Maggie in the kitchen. Afternoons were quieter. School lessons at the kitchen table, reading and arithmetic that Maggie taught with patient firmness. Evenings gathered them around the dinner table, 7 children, who were slowly, cautiously beginning to believe they might be safe. But beneath the surface of this new life, the clock was ticking. 27 days until the hearing. 27 days to prove to a court that Nathaniel Brennan could provide what 7 orphaned children needed. On the second Sunday after their arrival, Nate hitched the wagon and loaded all 9 of them for the ride to Redemption Creek. Church was not something he had attended regularly since Sarah's death, but Father Michael O'Connor was a good man, and Nate needed allies. More than that, he needed the community to see these children as part of something larger than Blackwood's accusations. The small church sat at the edge of town, whitewashed wood gleaming in the autumn sun. As Nate's wagon pulled up, heads turned. Conversation stopped. The appearance of the town's most notorious recluse, with 7 children in tow, was news worth noting. Inside the pews were nearly full. Nate guided his charges to seats near the back, acutely aware of the stares. Samuel kept the younger children close, his body language protective. Eliza held baby Hope, her eyes downcast. Tommy fidgeted until Maggie placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Father O'Connor was in his 60s, white-haired and sharp-eyed, with the weathered face of a man who had spent decades ministering to frontier souls. When he spotted Nate's family, his expression shifted from surprise to something warmer. Understanding, perhaps, or approval. The service was simple. Hymns sung by voices rough from hard living, scripture read with conviction. A sermon about the Good Samaritan that felt pointed enough to make several parishioners shift uncomfortably in their seats. When the sermon ended, Father O'Connor did not immediately dismiss the congregation. Instead, he gestured toward Nate and the children sitting in the back pew. "Before we close, I want to introduce someone," the priest said, his Irish accent carrying through the small church. "Nathaniel Brennan has returned to us after a long absence, and he's brought with him 7 souls who need our community's support." The congregation turned to look. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion. A few, like Maria Sanchez, offered warm smiles. "I know there are questions," O'Connor continued, "concerns about a single man caring for 7 children. But I've seen these young ones. They're healthy, happy, loved, and I ask that we as a community stand with this family rather than judge them." An uncomfortable silence filled the church. People shifted in their pews, unsure how to respond. Blackwood sat in the 3rd row, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes calculating. Then Samuel stood up. The 14-year-old boy rose from the back pew, his legs shaking, but his voice steady when he spoke. "Father, may I say something?" O'Connor looked surprised, but nodded. "Of course, son." Samuel stepped into the aisle, and every eye in the church turned to him. He looked so young, standing there, thin and worn, despite 2 months of good food. Yet something in his bearing and the set of his shoulders commanded attention. "My name is Samuel Porter. I'm 14 years old." His voice carried clear and strong. "For 2 years I took care of my 6 brothers and sisters after our parents died of fever. We had nowhere to go. The county sent us to Blackwood Home." He paused, his hands clenched at his sides. Nate started to rise, thinking to stop the boy from exposing himself like this, but Maggie's hand on his arm held him back. This was Samuel's moment, his choice. "Mr. Blackwood told us we should be grateful," Samuel continued, his voice hardening. "He said we were broken, worthless, defective. He made us work from before sunrise until after dark, hauling water, chopping wood, whatever needed doing. If we worked too slow or complained, he hit us with a leather strap." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Several people looked toward Blackwood, who sat rigid, his face reddening. "My brother Tommy was 8 years old when he couldn't lift a sack of wheat. Mr. Blackwood kicked him, broke his ribs." Samuel's voice cracked, but he pushed on. "We were hungry all the time. We slept 12 to a room. When Jacob got sick, nobody cared. When Eliza—" He stopped, unable to finish that sentence, took a breath, steadied himself. Then Mr. Brennan came to the auction. We were standing on that platform about to be sold separately. Different families, different towns. We were going to lose each other. Samuel turned to look at Nate, his eyes bright with emotion. He could have bought just me. I'm the oldest, the strongest, the one who could work a ranch, but he bought all 7 of us. $400, everything he had saved, because he didn't want us split apart. The boy's voice grew stronger, more certain. He gives us 3 meals every day. He taught us to read and write. He stayed up all night when Jacob was sick with fever. He sleeps in the barn so we feel safe in the house. Samuel wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. He's the first man who ever asked me if I was okay. The first one who treated us like we were worth something, like we mattered. He looked around the church at all the watching faces. I know it's strange, a single man with 7 children. But Mr. Brennan is a good man, the best man we've ever known. And we need this community to give us a chance, to let us be a family. The silence that followed was profound. Even Blackwood seemed at a loss for words, though his expression promised retribution later. Then Maria Sanchez stood up, her voice firm and clear. I stand with the Brennan family. Dr. Morrison rose next. As do I. One by one others stood, not everyone, not even half, but enough. A scattering of people throughout the church choosing to support rather than judge, choosing what felt right over what looked proper. Father O'Connor smiled, his eyes misty. Thank you, Samuel. That took great courage. He looked out over the congregation. This boy has shown us what faith looks like. Not the easy kind said in prayers and hymns, the hard kind spoken in truth despite fear. Let us all have such courage. After the service ended, O'Connor positioned himself at the door to greet his flock. Nathaniel Brennan, he said, his Irish accent still thick after 40 years in America. I heard you'd taken in some young souls. Yes, Father, 7 of them. O'Connor's gaze swept over the children lingering on each face. And how are you finding your new home, little ones? The children looked to Samuel, who spoke for them all. It's good, Father, better than before. Before being Blackwood's establishment, I presume. O'Connor's tone hardened slightly on the name. Yes, sir. The priest nodded slowly, then addressed Nate directly. Walk with me a moment, if you would. Nate instructed Maggie to take the children to the wagon, then followed O'Connor around the side of the church to a small garden where vegetables grew in neat rows. The priest moved with the stiffness of age, but the determination of purpose. I've known Cornelius Blackwood for 15 years, O'Connor said without preamble. The man is a wolf in shepherd's clothing. He takes government money meant for orphans and lines his own pockets. The children under his care work like slaves and eat like prisoners. I've seen the evidence of it. Have you now? O'Connor turned to face him. The bruises, the fear, the way they flinch when an adult moves too quickly. All of it. Then you understand what you're fighting. Blackwood won't let this go. He'll use every legal means to get those children back. They represent income to him. $70 a month from the government, plus whatever he makes hiring them out to farms. The number made Nate's jaw clench. I didn't know about the government payments. Most people don't. The Children's Aid Society is supposed to oversee the funds, ensure they're used properly. But Mrs. Whitmore, who runs the local office, is in Blackwood's pocket. She looks the other way in exchange for a share of the profits. Can you prove it? O'Connor's expression turned regretful. Suspicion is not proof, my son, but I have access to the church records. Every child who's passed through Blackwood's home in the past 5 years is documented. Baptisms mostly. I could provide you with names and dates. Would that help? It might. If you could track down where those children ended up, if you could prove they were sold rather than adopted properly. The priest paused. But that would take time you don't have. Your hearing is in 4 weeks. Less than that now, 27 days. O'Connor placed a weathered hand on Nate's shoulder. Then you need a different strategy. You need to prove you're a better guardian than Blackwood ever was. You need character witnesses. You need to show the children are thriving under your care. How? Bring them to church every Sunday. Let people see them healthy and happy. I'll make arrangements for them to attend school here in town 3 days a week. That addresses the education requirement, As for the rest, O'Connor hesitated. The law requires a woman in the household to supervise the girls. Your mother-in-law is there, yes? Maggie, but she's not well. Her heart. The priest's expression grew somber. Then you may need to consider other arrangements, a housekeeper perhaps, or... He did not finish the sentence, but Nate understood. Or a wife. The thought felt like betrayal even after 4 years. Sarah was still too present in his heart, too vivid in his memory. I'll figure something out, Nate said. Back at the wagon, he found Maria Sanchez talking to Maggie. Maria was a widow in her mid-40s with 3 grown children and a farm adjacent to Nate's land. She was known throughout the territory for her kindness and her cooking. Mr. Brennan, Maria said warmly, Maggie tells me you have your hands full these days. That's one way to put it. I've offered to help, Maria continued, to teach the girls cooking and household skills. It would give Maggie some rest, and it might help with your situation regarding the hearing. Nate glanced at Maggie, who nodded subtly. This was an answer to a problem he had not yet solved. A respectable woman helping with the children's care would satisfy at least part of the court's requirements. I'd appreciate that, Mrs. Sanchez. Thank you. It's Maria, please. And you're welcome. These children deserve a chance. The ride home was quieter than the ride to town, but not with fear. The children were processing what they had witnessed, a community beginning to accept them, adults willing to help, the possibility that this might actually work. That night, after the children were in bed, Nate sat with Maggie on the porch. The October air had turned cold winter, already showing its intentions. Maggie had wrapped herself in a thick shawl, but Nate could see she was shivering despite it. You should be inside, he said gently. In a moment. She looked out over the darkened land. Nathaniel, there's something I need to tell you. The tone of her voice made him turn to face her fully. What is it? My heart. It's worse than I've let on. Dr. Morrison says I have months, perhaps, not years. The words hit like a physical blow. Maggie had been his anchor through Sarah's death, through the nightmare of losing his son. She had stayed with him when she could have gone to live with her other daughter in Colorado. She had been the only family he had left. How long have you known? Since summer. I didn't want to burden you, but now with these children, her voice wavered. I need to know they'll be cared for. After. They will be. I promise you that. Maggie reached over and took his hand. Hers was cold, the bones fragile beneath papery skin. Sarah would be so proud of you, taking in these children, fighting for them. I'm doing it for her as much as for them. I know, but make sure you're also doing it for yourself. You've been half dead these 4 years, Nathaniel. These children are bringing you back to life. Don't waste that gift. Inside the house, a child cried out. Nate was on his feet immediately, but Maggie stopped him. That's Ruth, the nightmare again. Let me go to her. She needs a woman's comfort for this. Nate watched Maggie make her way inside, moving slower than she once had, and felt the weight of time pressing down. How much longer did he have with her? How would he manage 7 children without her steady presence? The answer came 3 days later in a way he had not expected. Tommy had been acting strangely all morning, disappearing between chores and returning with dirt under his fingernails and a secretive expression. When Nate finally cornered him in the barn, the boy was wrestling with something behind a stack of hay bales. What are you doing back there? Tommy emerged sheepish and defiant at once. In his arms was a mongrel puppy, all paws and ears and wagging tail. I found him in the woods. He was alone. I thought maybe we could keep him. The hope in the boy's voice was almost painful to hear. This child, who had been bought and sold like property, was asking permission to save something even more helpless than himself. Where did you really find him? Tommy's defiance crumbled. Old man Peterson's farm. He was going to drown the whole litter, said they were worthless mutts. I took this one. I know I shouldn't have without asking, but I couldn't let him die. Nate knelt down to examine the puppy. It licked his hand enthusiastically, tail whipping back and forth. Worthless was not the word he would have used. Spirited, maybe, full of life. "You did the right thing," Nate said. "Taking something helpless and giving it a chance, that's what family does." Tommy's eyes went wide. "We can keep him. On one condition, he's your responsibility. You feed him, train him, clean up after him. Can you handle that?" "Yes, sir, I promise." The puppy became a fixture of the household immediately, bringing chaos and joy in equal measure. Grace named him Patch for the black spot over one eye. Even Samuel, usually so serious, could be caught smiling when the dog tumbled over his own feet. But the happiness was short-lived. On Sunday, exactly 3 weeks before the hearing, Cornelius Blackwood made his move. Nate and the children were returning from church when they found Deputy Frank Miller waiting at the ranch. He was young for a lawman, maybe 30, with the kind of face that tried for authority but achieved only nervousness. "Mr. Brennan," Miller said, dismounting from his horse, "I have papers for you." Nate took the documents, his stomach sinking as he read. It was a formal complaint from the Children's Aid Society signed by Mrs. Whitmore. It detailed alleged inadequacies in Nate's care: insufficient income, lack of proper female supervision, failure to provide adequate education. Every point was technically addressable, but the implications were clear. They were building a case to take the children back. "There's more," Miller said, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Blackwood has petitioned the court to conduct an inspection of your property. Tomorrow." "Tomorrow, that's not enough notice." "It's what the judge ordered." "I'm sorry, Nate. I know you're trying to do right by these kids, but the law's the law." After Miller left, Nate gathered everyone in the kitchen. The children sat around the table, their faces pale with understanding. They had been through this before. Inspections, evaluations, the slow machinery of bureaucracy grinding them down. "They're going to try to take us back," Samuel said flatly. "No," Nate's voice was steel. "They're going to try. They won't succeed." "How can you stop them?" Eliza spoke for the first time in days, her voice small but desperate. Nate looked at each of them in turn. 7 faces watching him, believing in him, counting on him. "We make this house perfect. We show them children who are healthy, educated, and happy. We prove that you belong here." They worked through the night. Maggie directed the effort despite her exhaustion, her voice weak but determined. The girls cleaned every surface until it gleamed. The boys organized the barn and mended every broken fence rail. Nate went over accounts, preparing documentation of his income from the ranch. Maria Sanchez arrived at dawn with a wagon full of supplies: fresh bread, preserves, fabric for new clothes. She had heard about the inspection through the church network and had rallied other women to help. "You're not alone in this," she told Nate, as she supervised the girls in hemming new dresses. "This community may be slow to act, but once we decide what's right, we stand firm." The inspection team arrived at 10 in the morning. Mrs. Whitmore came first, a sour-faced woman in severe gray who looked at the children like they were livestock to be assessed. Behind her was a court clerk, and to Nate's surprise, Dr. Henry Morrison. Morrison was a good man, had been Sarah's doctor during her pregnancy. His presence was either a blessing or a curse, depending on whose side he was on. "Mrs. Whitmore," Nate said, keeping his voice level, "welcome to my home." "Mr. Brennan," her tone suggested she found the very air distasteful. "We're here to evaluate whether this environment is suitable for children." She walked through the house with the enthusiasm of someone inspecting a crime scene. She examined the sleeping quarters, ran a finger along surfaces looking for dust, opened cabinets to check their contents. The children followed her progress with terrified eyes, saying nothing. In the kitchen, she found Maggie teaching Ruth to read. The girl had made remarkable progress in 3 weeks, but Whitmore seemed unimpressed. "Reading primers are insufficient education for a child this age," she said, making notes on her clipboard. "She's also learning arithmetic and geography," Maggie countered, "and Father O'Connor has agreed to provide formal schooling 3 days a week." Whitmore's expression suggested this was inadequate, but not worth arguing. She moved on to inspect the boys' room where she found Samuel's few possessions neatly arranged. "These children arrived with nothing," she observed. "You haven't provided them with adequate clothing or personal items." "They arrived 3 weeks ago," Nate said, his patience fraying. "We've been getting them what they need as we can afford it. Maria Sanchez has been helping make new clothes. A neighbor woman is not adequate female supervision for growing girls." "I'm here," Maggie said, her voice sharp, despite its weakness. "I may be elderly, but I'm perfectly capable of chaperoning." Whitmore turned to examine Maggie with cold assessment. "You're also visibly unwell. How long before these children are left alone with a single man?" The impropriety is obvious. The implication made Nate's blood boil, but before he could respond, Dr. Morrison stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, if I may." His tone was diplomatic but firm. "I'd like to examine the children, to assess their health." "Of course." Morrison spent the next hour with each child individually. He checked their weight, their teeth, their skin. He listened to Jacob's lungs, which had improved dramatically with regular meals and Nate's care. He examined old bruises, now faded to yellow. He asked gentle questions about their daily routine, their happiness, their fears. When he finished, he pulled Nate aside, while Whitmore continued her inspection. "Those children have gained weight," Morrison said quietly. "They're healthier than I've seen any child from Blackwood's establishment. Jacob's lungs are still compromised, but he's responding well to treatment. Whatever you're doing, it's working." "Will you say that in your report?" Morrison hesitated. "Mrs. Whitmore controls what goes into the official documentation, but I'll make my own report available to the court. The truth matters, Nate. I knew Sarah. She'd want me to help." The inspection ended with Whitmore's face set in disapproval. She had found nothing overtly wrong, but she clearly wanted to. "The court will review my findings," she said at the door. "The hearing is in 3 weeks. I suggest you use that time to make arrangements for these children's return to proper care." After she left, the house fell silent. The children gathered in the kitchen, their brief hope crushed by the reality of what they faced. Nate stood at the window watching the inspection team's wagon disappear down the road. Behind him, he felt 7 pairs of eyes, watching, waiting for him to give up, to admit defeat. Instead, he turned to face them. "Tomorrow we start preparing for the hearing. We're going to fight this, all of us together." How? Tommy's question was small and lost. By telling the truth. By showing the court what family really means. That night, Maggie called Nate to her room. She was in bed too weak to hide her condition any longer. Her breathing was labored, her face pale in the lamplight. "Nathaniel, I need you to promise me something. Anything. When I'm gone, don't give up. These children need you. More than that, you need them." She reached for his hand. "I got to see my daughter's dream fulfilled. 7 children in this house, a family made whole. That's enough for me." "Maggie, don't talk like that. You'll get better. We both know better. But that's all right. I'm ready. I got to see you come back to life. That's worth everything." She closed her eyes, exhausted by even that small speech. Nate sat beside her bed until her breathing evened into sleep, his mind racing with everything that needed to be done. 3 weeks. It was not enough time, but it was all they had. And Nathaniel Brennan had never been one to surrender without a fight. November came to Wyoming with the kind of cold that settles into bones and refuses to leave. The first snow fell on a Tuesday morning 3 days before the hearing, dusting the ranch in white that made everything look clean and new. But inside the Brennan house, the mood was anything but peaceful. Maggie's condition had deteriorated rapidly. She spent most of her time in bed, now her breathing shallow and labored. Dr. Morrison visited twice in the past week, each time leaving with a graver expression. He did not need to say what everyone already knew. Time was running out. The children responded to this looming loss in different ways. Samuel threw himself into ranch work with almost manic intensity, as if hard labor could hold back death. Eliza spent hours sitting beside Maggie's bed reading aloud from the Bible or simply holding the old woman's hand. Tommy grew quieter, his usual energy dampened by the heaviness in the house. Even little Grace seemed to understand that something terrible was approaching. On Wednesday evening, 2 days before the hearing, Maggie called all 7 children to her room. Nate helped her sit up against the pillows, though the effort cost her dearly. Her face was gray, her hands trembling, but her eyes remained sharp and determined. "Come closer, all of you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have much time, and I need to say something important." The children gathered around her bed in a semicircle. Grace climbed up beside Maggie, careful not to jostle her. Baby Hope sat in Eliza's lap, sucking her thumb and watching with solemn eyes. "I'm dying," Maggie said simply. "We all know it, so there's no point pretending otherwise. But before I go, I want you to promise me something." "Anything," Samuel said, his voice thick. "Promise me you'll stay together. Promise me you'll fight for this family. And promise me you'll take care of Nathaniel the way he's taken care of you." "We promise," Eliza whispered, tears streaming down her face. Maggie reached out with shaking hands and touched each child's face in turn, as if memorizing them. When she got to Ruth, the 8-year-old who had been silent for so long, the girl suddenly spoke. "Please don't leave us, Grandma." The room went still. Ruth's voice, unused for months, was hoarse but clear. The fact that she had called Maggie Grandma made the moment even more profound. Maggie smiled, tears running down her own cheeks. "Oh, sweet child, I'm not leaving you. I'll be right here." She placed her hand over Ruth's heart. "And up there," she pointed toward the ceiling, "watching over all of you." She turned to Nate, who stood in the doorway, trying to maintain his composure. "And you, Nathaniel, you found your purpose again. Don't lose it when I'm gone. These children are your family now, your real family. Blood doesn't make family. Choice does." That night, Maggie slipped into sleep and did not wake again. By Thursday morning, her breathing had become so faint that Nate had to lean close to be sure she was still alive. He sat beside her bed, holding her hand, while the children took turns coming in to say goodbye. She died at sunset peacefully, her hand still clasped in Nate's. One moment she was there, the next she was simply gone, as if her spirit had decided it was time to follow Sarah into whatever came next. Nate sat there for a long time after his head bowed his shoulders, shaking with silent sobs. He had lost Sarah. He had lost his son. And now he had lost Maggie. The last connection to the life he had built before everything fell apart. A small hand touched his shoulder. He looked up to find Samuel standing beside him, tears on the boy's face but strength in his eyes. "We're still here, sir. You're not alone." The funeral was the next morning rushed because of the hearing that afternoon. Father O'Connor conducted a simple graveside service in the small cemetery behind the church. The entire town seemed to turn out despite the freezing wind and threat of more snow. Maggie had been well loved, and her death touched the community in ways Nate had not fully understood. Maria Sanchez wept openly. Doc Morrison stood with his hat in his hands, his expression sorrowful. Even Sheriff Briggs, usually so stoic, looked moved by the loss. The children stood in a line beside the grave, holding hands. They did not cry much. They had learned too young that tears changed nothing. But when Father O'Connor spoke about Maggie's kindness and her love for these 7 orphans, she had helped save Samuel's grip on Tommy's hand tightened visibly. After the service, as people offered their condolences, Mrs. Whitmore appeared at the edge of the gathering. She did not approach the grave or speak to anyone. She simply watched with cold calculation, and Nate knew what she was thinking. Maggie's death had eliminated the one female guardian in the house. The case against him had just gotten stronger. There was no time to properly grieve. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Nate and the 7 children were sitting in the Redemption Creek courthouse. a small wooden building that served as both courtroom and town hall. The room was packed, every bench filled with curious townspeople who had come to witness the proceedings. Judge Henry Caldwell presided, a man in his mid-60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of face that gave nothing away. He had a reputation for fairness, but also for strict adherence to the law. Whether that would work in Nate's favor remained to be seen. Cornelius Blackwood sat at one table with a lawyer Nate did not recognize, a thin man with cold eyes and expensive clothes. Mr. Sterling, according to the nameplate in front of him. Blackwood himself looked smug, confident of victory. At the other table sat Nate and Sheriff Briggs, who had agreed to represent him despite having no legal training. It was an arrangement born of necessity rather than strategy, and everyone in the room knew it. The children sat in the front row of the gallery, their small faces pale with fear. They had been through this before, these evaluations and judgments by adults who saw them as problems to be solved rather than people to be loved. Judge Caldwell called the room to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. We're here to determine the custody of 7 minor children currently in the care of Nathaniel Brennan. The Children's Aid Society has filed a petition to return said children to the Blackwood Home for Orphaned Children. Mr. Sterling, you may begin. Sterling stood his movement smooth and practiced. Your Honor, this is a simple matter of law and common sense. Mr. Brennan, while perhaps well-intentioned, is utterly unqualified to care for 7 children. He is an unmarried man with no female supervision in his household. His income from ranching is insufficient to support such a large family. He has no formal training in child care or education. Sterling concluded his opening with practiced confidence. The law is clear, Your Honor. Mr. Brennan, while well-intentioned, cannot provide the institutional care these children require. They should be returned to Blackwood Home immediately. Judge Caldwell turned to Briggs. Sheriff, your response? Briggs stood looking distinctly uncomfortable in his role as lawyer. Your Honor, Nathaniel Brennan is a good man. He served honorably in the cavalry. He's run a successful ranch for 10 years. He saw 7 children about to be split up and sold separately, and he bought them all to keep them together. That's not the action of someone unqualified. That's the action of someone who understands what family means. It was a decent opening, but Nate could see it was not enough. Sterling was a professional. Briggs was a well-meaning amateur. They needed something more. Judge Caldwell looked thoughtful. The court will hear testimony. Mr. Sterling, call your first witness. I call Mrs. Helena Whitmore. The severe woman took the stand, her expression as cold as the November wind outside. She was sworn in and settled into the witness chair with practiced ease. Sterling approached her with deference. Mrs. Whitmore, please tell the court about your role with the Children's Aid Society. I am the regional director for Wyoming Territory. I oversee the placement and care of orphaned children throughout this area. And in your professional capacity, you inspected Mr. Brennan's property. I did, 3 weeks ago. What did you find? Whitmore consulted notes that Nate suspected she had memorized. The house was adequate in size, but lacked proper amenities for children. The educational materials were insufficient. Most concerning, the only adult female in the household was Mrs. Margaret Brennan, who was clearly in poor health and has since passed away. This leaves 7 children, including 4 girls, in the sole care of an unmarried man. The impropriety is obvious. Murmurs ran through the courtroom. Several people nodded in agreement. The Victorian sensibilities of the age made Whitmore's concerns seem legitimate to many. And what is your recommendation? Sterling asked. That these children be returned immediately to Blackwood Home, where they can receive proper care from qualified staff in an appropriate institutional setting. Sterling nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Judge Caldwell looked to Briggs. Sheriff, your cross-examination? Briggs stood shuffling papers nervously. Mrs. Whitmore, you said the Blackwood Home provides proper care. Have you personally inspected that facility recently? I inspect it quarterly, as required by regulation. And when was your last inspection? 6 months ago. 6 months. And in that inspection, did you notice any signs of abuse or neglect? Whitmore's expression did not change. The children were adequately fed and housed. Adequately, not well. Not thriving, adequately. Briggs gained confidence. Mrs. Whitmore, did you examine the 7 children now in Mr. Brennan's care for signs of prior abuse? I noted some old bruising, yes, common among active children. Dr. Morrison examined those same children. He found evidence of systematic physical abuse, malnutrition, untreated illnesses. Would you like to explain how you missed those signs during your quarterly inspections? Sterling jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. The witness cannot be expected to account for conditions that may have occurred between inspections. Judge Caldwell considered. Overruled. The witness may answer. Whitmore's composure slipped slightly. As I said, I inspect quarterly. I cannot monitor every moment of every child's life. But isn't that your job? Briggs pressed. To ensure children in your care are safe, in the state's care, Sheriff. And yes, that is my responsibility. Which is why I believe these children belong in a licensed institution rather than with an unmarried rancher. It was a good deflection, Nate had to admit. Whitmore had years of experience navigating these situations. The testimony continued. Sterling called Blackwood himself to the stand. The man was smooth and practiced painting a picture of his home as a haven of Christian charity, where unfortunate children received food, shelter, and moral instruction. We provide structure, Blackwood said earnestly. Discipline, values. These are things children desperately need, especially children who have lost their parents and are adrift in the world. And the allegations of abuse? Sterling asked, as if the question pained him. Completely unfounded. Children sometimes need correction, of course, a firm hand to guide them toward proper behavior. But abuse? Never. I love every child who comes through my doors. Nate's hands clenched into fists under the table. The lies were so smooth, so practiced, that even people who should have known better were nodding along. When Briggs cross-examined, he tried to crack Blackwood's facade. Mr. Blackwood, how much money do you receive from the government for each child in your care? $10 per month per child to offset the costs of their care. And how many children are currently at your facility? 23. 23 children. That's $230 per month in government funds, plus whatever you charge families who hire your children for labor. Blackwood's expression hardened. Any work the children do is for their own betterment, to teach them skills and work ethic. How much of that money goes to the children themselves for clothes, education, medical care? All of it goes to their care, Sheriff. Running a facility is expensive. Then you won't mind providing financial records showing how those funds are spent. Sterling objected immediately. Irrelevant, Your Honor. Mr. Blackwood's finances are not the issue here. We're discussing Mr. Brennan's fitness as a guardian. Judge Caldwell sustained the objection, and Briggs sat down frustrated. The afternoon wore on. More witnesses, more testimony, all of it building a case that Nate was unfit, that the children belonged in an institution, that individual care from an unmarried man was inappropriate and potentially dangerous. Through it all, the 7 children sat motionless in their seats, watching their fate being decided by strangers. Nate could see the hope draining from their faces with each passing hour. They had dared to believe they might have found a home. Now that belief was being systematically destroyed. As the sun began to set and the courtroom grew dark, Judge Caldwell finally spoke. It's late. We'll recess until tomorrow morning. Mr. Brennan, you may present your case then. But I'll be honest with you. Based on what I've heard today, the law seems clear. A single man cannot provide adequate care for 7 children, especially not young girls. Unless you can present compelling evidence to the contrary, I'm inclined to rule in favor of the Children's Aid Society. The gavel fell and the courtroom began to empty. People filed out their conversations, a low buzz of speculation and judgment. Most seemed to think the case was already decided. Nate sat at his table staring at nothing feeling the weight of impending failure crushing down on him. He had promised these children 7 promises, and he was about to break every one of them. A hand touched his shoulder. He looked up to find Father O'Connor standing there, his expression urgent. "Nathaniel, don't give up yet. I found something that could change everything." "What?" The priest pulled a folder from his coat. "Records from the church archives. Baptisms mostly, but also death certificates. 27 children have passed through Blackwood's home in the past 5 years. I can account for 11 of them, legitimate adoptions to families I know, but 16 have simply disappeared. No adoption records, no death certificates, nothing." Nate's heart began to pound. What happened to them? That's what we need to find out. If we can prove Blackwood has been selling children, or worse, it changes the entire case, but we need time. Time to investigate, to track down those missing children. The judge is ruling tomorrow. Then we need to buy more time. Somehow. O'Connor's eyes were fierce. Those children deserve justice, Nathaniel, and you deserve the chance to prove you're the father they need. Outside, Nate found the 7 children waiting by the wagon. They climbed in silently, their faces showing the strain of the day. As Nate guided the horses toward home through the gathering darkness, no one spoke. What was there to say? They had lost Maggie that morning. By tomorrow, they might lose everything else. At the ranch, the house felt emptier than ever. Maggie's absence was a presence of its own, a hollow space that reminded them all of how fragile their happiness had been. Nate made dinner mechanically, though no one ate much. The children went to bed early, seeking escape in sleep, all except Samuel, who lingered in the kitchen after the others had gone. "We're going to lose, aren't we?" the boy asked quietly. Nate wanted to lie, to offer false hope, but Samuel deserved honesty. "I don't know. The law isn't on our side." "Then we run, tonight. Head west. They can't take us back if they can't find us. Running makes us fugitives. It proves we're in the wrong. So we just give up. Go back to Blackwoods." Samuel's voice cracked. "You promised. You said you'd never abandon us." "I'm not abandoning you. I'm fighting for you. Tomorrow we tell the truth. We show the court what family really means." What if the truth isn't enough? Nate had no answer for that. He pulled Samuel into an embrace, feeling the boy's thin shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. "We'll face it together," Nate said. "Whatever happens, we face it as a family." That night, Nate lay awake in the barn staring at the dark ceiling. Sarah's face floated in his mind. Her smile, her faith in him, the way she had made him promise to find someone to care for. He had found 7 someones, and he was about to lose them all. The only question was whether he could find a way to keep his promise, or whether some promises were simply impossible to keep. Morning came too quickly. The second day of the hearing dawned cold and gray, with clouds pregnant with snow hanging low over the Wyoming plains. Nate stood in the barn, buttoning his good shirt with hands that trembled slightly. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 7 faces looking up at him with trust he was about to betray. Inside the house, the children were getting ready in silence. No breakfast. No one had appetite for food when their entire future hung in the balance. Eliza had dressed the younger ones in their best clothes, the simple dresses and trousers that Maria Sanchez had helped make. They looked like proper children now, not the half-starved waifs who had stood on that auction platform 2 months ago. But would it be enough? The ride to town was funeral quiet. Even baby Hope seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, staying silent in Eliza's arms. The wagon wheels crunched through frost-hardened earth, the only sound in a world holding its breath. The courthouse was already full when they arrived, more people than yesterday, drawn by the drama of a conclusion. Nate helped each child down from the wagon, his hands lingering on their shoulders as if he could anchor them to him through sheer will. Sheriff Briggs met them at the door, his face grave. "Father O'Connor's been up all night. He found 2 of the missing children. They're here, ready to testify." A spark of hope flared in Nate's chest, but he tamped it down. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to crushing disappointment. Inside, Judge Caldwell was already seated. Blackwood and Sterling sat at their table confident and relaxed. They thought they had won. The smirk on Blackwood's face made Nate's blood boil. "Mr. Brennan," the judge said as Nate took his seat, "you may present your defense. I warn you, the burden of proof is substantial. You must demonstrate not just that you can care for these children, but that you are a better option than a licensed institution." Briggs stood clearing his throat. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Samuel Porter to the stand." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Calling a child to testify was unusual, but not unheard of. Samuel stood his 14-year-old frame trying to project confidence he did not feel. He walked to the witness stand with measured steps, was sworn in, and sat with his hands clasped tight in his lap. "Samuel," Briggs began gently, "tell the court about your life at Blackwood Home." The boy's jaw tightened. For a moment Nate thought he might refuse to speak. Then Samuel looked at his siblings in the gallery, at their frightened faces, and something hardened in his expression. "We woke at 5 every morning, before the sun. We worked until dark, hauling water, chopping wood, whatever Mr. Blackwood needed." Samuel's voice was steady, but his knuckles were white. "If we worked slow, he hit us, with a strap, sometimes his fists." "Objection," Sterling called out. "Hearsay and inflammatory." "It's not hearsay if it happened to me." Samuel shot back, his composure cracking. "I have scars on my back to prove it." Judge Caldwell leaned forward. "Young man, are you saying you were physically abused at Blackwood Home?" "Yes, sir. Me and all my brothers and sisters. Tommy got his ribs broken when he couldn't carry a sack of flour. He was 8 years old." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Blackwood's face reddened, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Your Honor, this is absurd," Sterling said smoothly. "The boy is clearly lying to help his current guardian. Children will say anything when coached." "I'm not lying." Samuel stood up in the witness box, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "And nobody coached me. I'm telling the truth because somebody needs to." Judge Caldwell rapped his gavel. "Order. Samuel, please continue, but stick to facts you personally witnessed." Samuel sat back down, breathing hard. "We were hungry all the time. Breakfast was thin porridge, lunch was bread and water, dinner was whatever scraps were left. Mr. Blackwood ate well. We could smell his meals cooking while we went to bed with empty stomachs." He turned to look directly at Blackwood. "You told us we were worthless, broken, that nobody would ever want us. You said we should be grateful you even kept us alive." Samuel's voice cracked, his composure finally breaking now, but his voice never wavered. "Then Mr. Brennan bought us, all 7 of us. He could have bought just me, the strong one who could work, but he bought all of us because he didn't want us split up." The boy's voice broke. "He gave us rooms, real beds, 3 meals a day. He taught us to read and ride and shoot. He stayed up all night when Jacob was sick. He slept in the barn so we'd feel safe." Samuel looked at Nate, his eyes swimming with tears and something fiercer. Love, maybe, or loyalty. "He's the first man who ever asked if I was okay, the first one who cared about more than what I could do for him. He's not my blood, but he's my father in every way that matters." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Several people were wiping their eyes. Even Judge Caldwell looked moved. Briggs let the moment breathe before asking quietly, "Samuel, do you want to go back to Blackwood Home? I'd rather die." Sterling jumped up for cross-examination, his smooth demeanor slightly rattled. "Samuel, isn't it true that you're grateful to Mr. Brennan for better conditions, that you might exaggerate about your previous circumstances to ensure you can stay?" "No, sir." "Isn't it possible that the discipline you received at Blackwood Home was necessary and appropriate, that you're simply a difficult child who resented structure?" Samuel's eyes went cold. "You can ask Tommy about his broken ribs if you want proof, or Eliza about why she stopped talking for 6 months, or Ruth about why she hasn't said a word in almost a year. We're not difficult, we're damaged, because of what that man did to us." He pointed at Blackwood, his hands shaking with rage and grief and terrible beautiful honesty. Sterling tried a few more questions, but Samuel's testimony had struck bone. Blackwood shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is slander. I never laid an inappropriate hand on any child." Judge Caldwell's gavel cracked like thunder. "Mr. Blackwood, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." Eliza was crying now, great heaving sobs, but she continued, "I told Samuel. He started locking our door at night, but I was so scared. Every night I was scared he'd come back." She looked up at Nate. Eliza's shoulders shook with silent sobs. "At Mr. Brennan's house, he sleeps in the barn, so we know we're safe. He's never even come upstairs, except when Jacob was sick. He treats us like we're precious, like we matter." Her voice dropped back to a whisper. "Nobody ever treated us like we mattered before." Briggs had no more questions. Sterling, visibly uncomfortable, declined to cross-examine. Even he could see that attacking a crying 12-year-old girl would destroy whatever credibility he had left. Tommy came next. The 10-year-old strutted to the stand with false bravado that fooled no one. His testimony was angry and defiant. He talked about the broken ribs, about the constant hunger, about being called stupid and worthless. He talked about finding Patch the puppy and how Mr. Brennan had let him keep it, even though they already had too many mouths to feed. "He didn't have to do that," Tommy said fiercely, "but he did, because that's what fathers do. They care about what makes you happy." Ruth was called next, the 8-year-old who had not spoken in almost a year. She walked to the stand with tiny, hesitant steps, was sworn in, sat down in the witness chair, her feet dangling well above the floor. Briggs knelt beside her, making himself small and unthreatening. "Ruth, I know you haven't spoken in a long time, but this is important. Can you tell us why you stopped talking?" Ruth looked at her siblings, at Samuel's encouraging nod, at Eliza's tear-stained face, at Tommy's fierce loyalty. Then she looked at Nate, and something in her expression shifted. "I saw my parents die." Her voice was rough from disuse, but clear. Every person in that courtroom leaned forward, straining to hear. The fever. It took them both. Mama first, then Papa 3 days later. I was there. I watched them go. And after that, I couldn't make words come out anymore. They just stayed stuck inside. Ruth's eyes glistened in the lamplight. "At Blackwood's, nobody cared if I talked or not. I was just another mouth to feed, another worker. It didn't matter if I had a voice." She looked directly at Nate. "But Mr. Brennan cared. He never made me talk. He just waited, and Mrs. Maggie taught me to read. She said I had a voice, and I could use it whenever I was ready." Ruth stood up in the witness box, her small frame radiating unexpected strength. "I'm ready now. Don't take us away from Papa, please. He's all we have." The courtroom erupted, not in whispers this time, but in open emotion. Women were crying. Men were clearing their throats and looking away. Even Judge Caldwell had to remove his spectacles and wipe his eyes. Through it all, Blackwood sat rigid, his face a mask of fury and fear. He could see the tide turning against him. The younger children did not testify. They were too small, their words would carry less weight. But the damage was done. 4 children had told their stories, and those stories painted a picture that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. During the brief recess, Father O'Connor approached the bench with 2 young men in their late teens, former residents of Blackwood Home, who had been tracked down the night before. Their testimony was devastating. Both described being sold to farms as unpaid labor when they were 12 and 13. Neither had received any of the promised education or care. Both bore scars from beatings, and both confirmed that children regularly disappeared from Blackwood's facility with no documentation of where they went. By the time they finished, Blackwood's composure had completely shattered. He sat at his table sweating visibly, his expensive lawyer looking increasingly uncomfortable beside him. Briggs stood, his confidence growing with each witness who supported their case. "Your Honor, I have one more witness, Deputy Frank Miller." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Miller had been Blackwood's man, everyone knew it. The young deputy walked to the stand slowly, his face pale but determined. When he was sworn in, his hand shook slightly on the Bible. "Deputy Miller," Briggs began, "how long have you worked in Redemption Creek?" "3 years, sir." "And during that time, did you have any dealings with Cornelius Blackwood?" Miller glanced at Blackwood, whose face had gone purple with rage. Then he looked at the 7 children sitting in the gallery at their frightened faces, and something in his expression hardened. "Yes, sir. Mr. Blackwood paid me to look the other way. $20 a month to not ask questions when children disappeared from his facility, to not investigate complaints of abuse." The courtroom erupted. Judge Caldwell's gavel cracked for order. "I kept records," Miller continued, pulling folded papers from his jacket. "Every payment he made to me, every child I helped him traffic by staying silent. 16 children in 3 years just vanished. No adoption papers, no death certificates, nothing." He looked directly at Blackwood. "I'm done being your man. I'd rather lose my badge than help you hurt one more child." Sterling shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this witness is clearly trying to save himself from prosecution by implicating my client." "Maybe so," Miller said quietly, "but that doesn't make it untrue. Everything I said can be verified, and I'm willing to face whatever consequences come from finally doing the right thing." Judge Caldwell took the papers, examined them with a grave expression, then looked at Blackwood with undisguised disgust. Sterling made one last attempt. "Your Honor, even if we accept these allegations, which my client denies, the issue remains that Mr. Brennan is a single man. The law requires proper supervision, especially for young girls. He cannot provide that." Judge Caldwell turned to Nate. "Mr. Brennan, do you have anything to say on this matter?" Nate stood slowly. He had not planned to speak, had figured Briggs would handle the legal arguments, but looking at those 7 faces, watching him, trusting him, counting on him, he found words he did not know he had. "Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know all the legal requirements, but I know what family means. It's not about blood. It's not about being married or single. It's about showing up every day, about putting someone else's needs before your own." He gestured to the children. 4 years ago, I lost my wife and son. I stopped living. I was just going through the motions, waiting to die. Then I saw 7 children about to be split apart and sold like cattle, and I heard my wife's voice telling me what she told me before she died. "Find someone to care for. Don't die alone." His voice grew stronger. "I didn't take these children to replace what I lost. I took them because they needed someone to fight for them. And somewhere in that I found something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to live, a reason to try, a reason to be better than I was." He looked at Judge Caldwell directly. "You're right that I'm not married, that I don't have a woman in the house. Mrs. Sanchez has agreed to serve as housekeeper and supervisor. Father O'Connor has arranged schooling. Dr. Morrison can testify to their improved health. But at the end of the day, what these children need most is someone who loves them. And I do, with everything I have." Before the judge could respond, a small voice called out from the gallery, "Papa!" It was Grace. The 4-year-old scrambled down from the bench and ran toward Nate, her small legs pumping. She threw herself at him, wrapping tiny arms around his legs. "Don't let them take us, Papa, please." One by one, the other children moved. Jacob and Tommy came next, then Ruth. Eliza with baby Hope. Even Samuel, trying to be strong, finally broke and joined his siblings. All 7 children surrounded Nate, clinging to him, crying, begging, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world trying to tear them apart. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as Nate knelt down, gathering all 7 children in his arms. He was crying now, too, not caring who saw, not caring about dignity or decorum. These were his children, his family, and he would fight heaven and hell to keep them. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Papa's here. I won't let anyone take you. I promise." Judge Caldwell sat at his bench watching this scene unfold. His face was unreadable, but his hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his gavel. The courtroom held its breath. Everything hung on what came next. 7 futures, 1 family. A choice between law and justice, between what was legal and what was right. Finally, the judge spoke. I've been on this bench for 30 years. In that time, I've made thousands of rulings. I've followed the letter of the law, even when it hurt. Because the law is supposed to protect the innocent, ensure fairness, create order from chaos. He looked at Blackwood, his expression hardening. But I've also learned that sometimes the law fails us. Sometimes it protects the wrong people and punishes the innocent. And when that happens, it's my job to correct it. The judge turned to the children, his voice gentler. I've heard your testimony today. I've seen the scars you bear, both visible and invisible. I've watched you cling to the man you call Papa with a desperation that speaks louder than any legal argument. He picked up his gavel, and in that moment, the entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. This court finds that Cornelius Blackwood and the Blackwood Home for Orphaned Children are unfit to care for these or any children. Effective immediately, the facility will be closed pending criminal investigation into allegations of abuse, fraud, and child trafficking. Blackwood surged to his feet. You can't do this. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent while I finish, Caldwell snapped. Guards, if Mr. Blackwood speaks again, remove him. The judge continued. As for Nathaniel Brennan, while the arrangement is unconventional, this court finds that the children's welfare is paramount. They are thriving in his care. They love him, and he clearly loves them. Caldwell looked at Nate. I am granting you legal custody of all 7 Porter children with the following conditions. Mrs. Maria Sanchez will serve as household supervisor and will report monthly on the children's welfare. The children will attend school as arranged by Father O'Connor and Dr. Morrison will conduct quarterly health examinations. The gavel fell. Custody is granted. This family is hereby recognized by this court. Case closed. The courtroom exploded. People cheered. Women wept openly. Men clapped each other on the back. And at the center of it all, Nathaniel Brennan knelt on the floor with 7 children in his arms, all of them crying and laughing and holding each other like they would never let go. Blackwood was led away in handcuffs, still protesting, still insisting on his innocence. But no one was listening anymore. His time was over. Father O'Connor appeared beside Nate, his weathered face split in a huge smile. Well done, my son. Well done. Maria Sanchez was there too, already making plans. We need to celebrate. A proper family dinner. Everyone is invited. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Nate stood with his children, his family, and felt something he had not felt in 4 years. Complete, whole. Like the broken pieces of his life had finally impossibly been put back together. Not in the same pattern, not in the way he had expected, but in a new configuration that somehow worked even better than before. 7 children, 7 promises. And now, legally and forever, 7 souls entrusted to his care. Papa. The word echoed in his heart, not a replacement for what he had lost, but a new beginning, a second chance, a future he had never imagined but could no longer imagine living without. They had won. 1 year later, autumn painted the Wyoming plains in shades of gold and amber. Nathaniel Brennan stood on the porch of his ranch house, coffee steaming in his hand, watching the sun rise over land that had witnessed so much transformation. The house behind him was alive with sound. Children's laughter, the clatter of breakfast dishes, Patch the dog barking at something only he could see, the sounds of family. Samuel appeared in the doorway, now 15, and shooting up toward manhood. His shoulders had broadened from honest work, and the haunted look that had lived in his eyes was mostly gone. Mostly. Some scars took longer to heal. Papa, the fence in the north pasture needs mending. Tommy and I can handle it after school if you want. Papa. The word still hit Nate square in the chest every time, a gift he had never expected and would never take for granted. Good. I'll check your work this evening. Nate turned to study the boy. How are you doing with the McGuffey reader? Samuel made a face. It's fine. Miss Eliza is a harder teacher than anyone at the schoolhouse." Eliza had indeed become the household's unofficial educator, supplementing the 3 days a week the children spent at Father O'Connor's school with rigorous home lessons. At 13, she had developed a love for learning that had surprised everyone, especially herself. The past year had been one of gradual healing and careful growth. After the trial, the town of Redemption Creek had rallied around the Brennan family in ways Nate had not anticipated. Maria Sanchez had become a fixture at the ranch, teaching the girls to cook and sew, while serving as the female supervision the court required. Father O'Connor visited weekly, bringing books and leading evening prayers that even Nate had come to find comforting. Dr. Morrison made his quarterly examinations, each time marveling at the children's progress. Jacob's persistent cough had finally disappeared with regular meals and clean air. Tommy had gained 15 pounds. Even baby Hope, now 2.5, was thriving beyond all expectations. The investigation into Blackwood's operations had uncovered horrors worse than anyone had imagined. 23 children traced to illegal labor contracts, 5 sold to families in other territories with forged adoption papers, and 3 heartbreakingly found dead from neglect and abuse. Cornelius Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. Mrs. Whitmore lost her position and was barred from ever working with children again. The Blackwood home itself had been converted into a proper orphanage run by the church, with Father O'Connor overseeing operations. Children who had been rescued from similar situations now lived there under genuine care. The irony was not lost on anyone. Breakfast that morning was the usual controlled chaos. 7 children and Nate gathered around the long table that had once seemed too large and now felt exactly right. Eliza had made flapjacks with Maria's guidance. Ruth poured milk without spilling. Tommy argued with Jacob about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Grace sang a made-up song to baby Hope, who clapped along with sticky hands. It was perfect in its imperfection. After the meal, the older children prepared for school, while Nate helped the younger ones with their morning routine. These small moments, once foreign and frightening, had become the bedrock of his new life. Buttoning Grace's coat, making sure Ruth had her reading primer, reminding Tommy not to bring frogs home in his pockets again. The ride to the schoolhouse took 20 minutes, the wagon bouncing over familiar ruts in the road. Samuel drove now, his hands confident on the reins. Nate sat beside him, watching the landscape roll past and marveling at how much could change in a single year. At the schoolhouse, Father O'Connor greeted them warmly. The old priest had aged visibly in the past months, but his spirit remained strong. He had become something of a grandfather to the children, filling the void left by Maggie's death. "Ah, my favorite family," he said, helping the children down from the wagon. "Ruth, I heard you read from the Bible in church on Sunday. Beautifully done." Ruth beamed. The girl, who had not spoken for nearly a year, now volunteered to read aloud at every opportunity, as if making up for lost time. After dropping the children at school, Nate returned to the ranch to tackle the endless work of running a cattle operation. But even the hard labor felt different now. Before, work had been an escape from grief. Now it was building something for the future, for 7 futures. He was repairing the barn door when Sheriff Briggs rode up, his expression troubled. "Tom," Nate greeted him, wiping sweat from his brow. "What brings you out?" Briggs dismounted, looking uncomfortable. "Got some news. Thought you should hear it from me before anyone else." Nate's stomach tightened. "What happened?" "Blackwood. He died in prison last night. Some kind of altercation with other inmates. Guards say it was quick." The news settled over Nate like a heavy blanket. He felt no joy at the man's death, but no sorrow either, just a sense of finality. The monster who had tormented 7 children was gone, and with him any lingering threat he might have posed. "The children don't need to know the details," Nate said quietly. "Just that he's gone, that they're safe." Briggs nodded. "Figured you'd want it that way. There's something else, though. Blackwood's property is being liquidated. The court wants to know if you'd be interested in buying the home, converting it completely to legitimate use." Nate considered. The building itself was sound, and under Father O'Connor's care, it was already becoming a place of healing rather than horror. But did he want that responsibility? "I'll talk to the father about it, see what makes sense." After Briggs left, Nate stood in the barn processing the news. Blackwood's death marked the end of a chapter. The man who had caused so much suffering was gone. But the damage he had done would echo through years, maybe lifetimes. All Nate could do was provide the love and stability these 7 children needed to overcome that damage. That evening, he told the children about Blackwood's death as gently as possible. Their reactions varied. Samuel showed visible relief. Eliza cried, though whether from sadness or release, Nate could not tell. Tommy punched the air triumphantly until Nate gave him a look that said such celebration was inappropriate. The younger ones did not fully understand, but they sensed the adults' emotions and grew quiet. "What matters," Nate said, gathering them close, "is that you're safe now, forever. That man can never hurt you or anyone else again." That night, Grace had a nightmare. She woke screaming, and Nate was there within seconds despite sleeping in what had once been Maggie's room. He no longer needed to sleep in the barn. Time and trust had proven his intentions beyond doubt. He held the 4-year-old until her sobs subsided, whispering the same words he had whispered 100 times before. "You're safe. Papa's here. No one will hurt you." Eventually, she fell back asleep in his arms, and Nate carried her back to the girls' room. Eliza was awake, watching from her bed. "Papa," she whispered, "are you glad he's dead?" The question was harder than it should have been. Nate settled Grace back into bed before answering. "I'm glad you're safe. That's all that matters to me." "Is it wrong that I'm happy he's gone?" Nate sat on the edge of her bed, his voice gentle in the darkness. "No, sweetheart, it's not wrong. He hurt you terribly. Feeling relief that the person who hurt you can't hurt you anymore is natural. But don't let that relief turn to bitterness. Don't let what he did define who you become." Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Do you think Mama and Maggie are together, wherever they are? I like to think so." "Do you think they're proud of us?" Nate's throat tightened. "I know they are." The seasons turned. Winter came with heavy snows that buried the ranch in white silence. The children learned to ice skate on the frozen creek. They had snowball fights that left everyone soaked and laughing. Christmas was celebrated with a tree Maria helped them decorate and gifts Nate had made by hand. Simple things: a doll for Grace, a new knife for Tommy, books for the older children. On Christmas morning, as they gathered around the tree, Nate felt Sarah's presence so strongly it was almost physical. This was what she had wanted for him, not to replace what they had lost, but to find new love, new purpose, new life. Spring brought new challenges. Jacob developed a fascination with medicine after watching Dr. Morrison treat a neighbor's broken leg. Ruth discovered a talent for drawing, filling tablet after tablet with sketches of the ranch and her siblings. Tommy announced he wanted to be a blacksmith, having become friends with the smithy in town. The children were growing, becoming individuals with dreams and personalities that had been suppressed under Blackwood's cruelty. Watching them blossom was the greatest gift Nate had ever received. By summer, Samuel had grown tall enough to look Nate in the eye. The boy who had been so suspicious, so guarded, had transformed into a young man of remarkable character. He worked the ranch with skill and dedication, never shirking even the hardest tasks. One evening, as they mended fence together, Samuel spoke quietly. "Papa, I've been thinking about the future. Oh, I want to stay here, work the ranch with you, build it into something that can support all of us, maybe even take over someday when you're ready." Nate stopped working his chest, full of emotions he could not name. "You're 15. You have time to decide what you want to do with your life." "I've already decided. This is home. You're my father. These are my brothers and sisters. I want to help build something that lasts." The simple declaration contained more meaning than Samuel probably realized. This boy, who had been told he was worthless, who had been bought and sold like property, was choosing to invest his future in the family that had chosen him. "Then we'll build it together," Nate said, pulling the boy into a rough embrace. "All of us together." The years that followed proved Samuel's commitment. At 16, he was running much of the ranch's day-to-day operations. At 17, he helped Nate expand the herd and purchase additional land. By 18, he was a partner in every sense, his name added to the deed alongside Nate's. Eliza pursued her love of learning with single-minded determination. At 15, she was helping Father O'Connor teach younger children at the school. At 17, she left for Teachers College in Denver, the first of the children to venture into the wider world. It hurt to see her go, but Nate was proud beyond measure. She returned 2 years later with a teaching certificate and took a position at the Redemption Creek School. She never married, devoting herself instead to educating 2 generations of frontier children. But she was happy, fulfilled in ways that had nothing to do with conventional expectations. Tommy indeed became a blacksmith, apprenticing at 14 and opening his own shop at 20. He married at 22, a spirited young woman who matched his energy. Their 3 children became Nate's first grandchildren, and watching Tommy become a father was a moment of profound joy. The boy who had been beaten for being too wild was now a gentle, patient parent who never raised his voice in anger. Ruth's artistic talent led her to an unexpected path. A traveling artist saw her work and arranged for her to study in San Francisco. She was hesitant to leave, but Nate encouraged her. "Your gift needs room to grow. We'll be here when you visit. And you'll always have a home to come back to." She became a successful illustrator, her work appearing in magazines and books across the country. But she returned to Wyoming every summer, and her studio in town became a gathering place for aspiring artists. Jacob's fascination with medicine never wavered. Dr. Morrison took him on as an unofficial apprentice at 12. By 16, Jacob was assisting with basic medical procedures. He studied under Morrison for years before attending medical school in Chicago. He returned to Redemption Creek as a qualified physician, taking over Morrison's practice when the old doctor finally retired. Grace remained the family's bright spirit. She married young to a rancher's son and had 5 children of her own. Her house was always full of laughter, always open to family. She was the one who organized gatherings, who remembered birthdays, who made sure the family stayed connected even as they scattered. Baby Hope, who had been so small and vulnerable, grew into a determined young woman. She followed in Jacob's footsteps, becoming a nurse. She worked alongside her brother in his practice, the 2 of them forming a medical team that served the territory for decades. Through it all, Nathaniel Brennan remained the center. The steady presence, the father who had promised 7 things to 7 children and kept every promise. 20 years after that day in the courthouse, the entire family gathered for Thanksgiving. Samuel and his wife brought their 4 children. Tommy arrived with his brood of 5. Eliza came from her small house in town. Ruth traveled from San Francisco with her husband. Jacob and Hope closed the medical office for the holiday. Grace's family spilled out of 3 wagons. The ranch house that had once seemed too large now felt perfectly sized for the chaos of 3 generations. Nate, now in his late 50s, his hair more gray than dark, stood at the head of the table and looked at the sea of faces before him. 37 people, all connected by the choice he had made 2 decades earlier, all living proof that family was not about blood, but about love, about showing up, about keeping promises even when they seemed impossible. "Before we eat," Nate said, his voice carrying across the crowded room, "I want to tell you all something. 20 years ago, I was a dead man walking. I had lost everything that mattered. I was just waiting to die." He looked at his 7 children, now grown. "Then I saw 7 children on an auction block about to be split apart. And I made 7 promises: a roof over your heads, food in your bellies, skills to survive, protection from harm. I promised I would never hit you, never sell you, never abandon you." His voice grew thick with emotion. "I kept those promises, but what I didn't realize at the time was that you were making promises to me too, promises to let me be your father, to give me a reason to live, to show me that broken things could be made whole." Tears were flowing freely now, his and theirs. "You saved me as much as I saved you, maybe more. And I thank God every day for leading me to that town square 20 years ago, for giving me the courage to step forward, for letting me be your papa." Samuel stood, his own children watching with wide eyes. "Papa, we have something for you." He produced a wooden box clearly handmade with great care. Inside was a brass plaque engraved with words that made Nate's vision blur with tears. Nathaniel Brennan, who promised 7 things to 7 children and kept every promise, who taught us that family is not blood but choice, who showed us that broken people can be made whole through love. Our father, our hero, our papa. The room erupted in applause and tears. Children who did not fully understand the significance clapped because the adults were clapping. But those who knew the story, who understood the journey, wept openly. Nate held the plaque, running his fingers over the engraved words, and felt the last pieces of his broken heart finally completely heal. That night, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, Nate walked out to the family cemetery on the hill behind the house. 3 graves stood there: Sarah, his infant son, and Maggie buried between them. He knelt in the grass, the November cold seeping through his pants, and spoke to the 2 women who had shaped his life. "Sarah, I kept my promise. I found people to care for. 7 of them. They became my reason to live. Our son would have been 24 now. I think about him every day. But these 7 children, they filled a space I thought would be empty forever." He turned to Maggie Stone. "You were right. They brought me back to life. I just wish you could have seen them grow, seen what they became. You'd be so proud." The wind rustled through the grass, and Nate could almost hear their voices. Sarah's gentle encouragement, Maggie's practical wisdom, both telling him the same thing. Well done, well done. He stood, his knees protesting the movement, and looked back at the house. Lamplight glowed in the windows. Inside, Samuel was helping clean up. Tomorrow the cycle would begin again. Work, family, love. The simple rhythms of a life well lived. 30 years later, as Redemption Creek prepared to enter the 20th century, the town gathered to dedicate a monument. It stood in the town square on the exact spot where that auction platform had once been. A bronze statue of a man with 7 children clustered around him, their faces turned up to his with trust and love. The plaque read, "Nathaniel Brennan, 1845 to 1908, who taught us that one person can change the world 7 lives at a time, who proved that family is not blood but choice, who kept 7 promises and built a legacy of love." Samuel, now in his 60s, with grandchildren of his own, spoke at the dedication. His siblings stood beside him, aged but still bound by the ties forged in childhood trauma and adult love. "Our father used to say that he saved us," Samuel told the crowd, "but the truth is we saved each other. 7 broken children and 1 broken man, all putting each other back together piece by piece." He looked at the statue, at the bronze face of the man who had been everything a father should be. He made 7 promises to 7 scared children standing on a platform in this very spot. And he kept every one, not because it was easy, not because it was convenient, but because that's what love does. It shows up. It keeps promises. It never gives up. The crowd applauded, but Samuel was not finished. This statue is not just about one man. It's about the idea that broken things can be made whole, that love is stronger than law, that family is what we choose to make it. My father taught us that, and we're teaching it to our children, and they'll teach it to theirs. He touched the bronze hand of the statue, his voice dropping to a whisper that still carried, "Thank you, Papa, for everything." The dedication ended with a moment of silence, the town honoring a man who had shown them all what true fatherhood looked like. Then people dispersed, heading home to their own families, carrying with them the reminder that one person, one choice, one moment of courage could change everything. The statue stood in the square for generations. Children played around it, lovers met beside it, and every person who passed it knew the story. The mail-order bride advertisement that Nate had never answered became legend. The auction that had changed 8 lives. The 7 promises kept. Years faded into decades. The ranch passed to Samuel's son, then to his grandson. But it remained the Brennan Ranch, and every generation knew the story of how it all began. How one grieving widower had stepped forward on a September day in 1883 and bought 7 children, not because he needed workers, but because they needed someone to choose them. The legacy was not in land or money, though both endured. The legacy was in the hundreds of descendants who carried Brennan blood or name, in the teachers and doctors and blacksmiths and ranchers who traced their success back to 7 scared children and 1 determined man. The legacy was in the idea passed down through generations that love was a choice. That family was what you built, not what you were born into. That broken things could be made whole. That promises once made should be kept. 7 children, 7 promises, and a legacy that would outlast them all. In the end, Nathaniel Brennan's greatest achievement was not the ranch he built or the children he raised. It was the simple, profound truth he lived every day of his life after that auction. Love is not found. It is chosen, and once chosen, it is worth any price, any sacrifice, any struggle. 7 promises kept, 1 family made whole, a life well lived.